Dr. Loconte, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're going to ask if you'll just spend a few minutes giving us some opening comments on our topic today.
Sure. Kathy, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you guys. And again, special congratulations to you ladies, Aubrey, in your graduation there from Brigham Young, and Tova off to Harvard. That is just fabulous, ladies. Absolutely fabulous. Guys, let me give you a little big picture stuff as an historian, thinking about this kind of challenge of authoritarian or totalitarian regimes versus what we have here in the United States. So I'm going to take you back to history, just for a few moments here. If you think back to the turmoil of 17th century Europe, where you got two political visions are really emerging in the 17th century, the 1600s, two different political visions. One vision belonged to a guy named Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes believed that political stability, social stability, it depends on having an all-powerful state that basically dictates all aspects of our lives, what he called a Leviathan. That's a creature from the Old Testament, this monster sea creature, the state as a Leviathan. That was Thomas Hobbes's vision, an all-powerful state to maintain order. But the other competing vision that came about in the 17th century was from John Locke. Locke was an English philosopher. And Locke's basic idea is, look, people were born free and equal, and they are endowed by God with certain unalienable rights. And so we need a government that respects those rights, government by consent of the governed. And as we'll talk about before we're done, I'm sure, Locke really influenced the American founders. So we got these two. Think about what's going on in the world today. This is not just a history lesson for the sake of a history lesson. Think about what's going on in the world today. You got Russia and China. If you think about it, these are the two big Hobbesian states. They model their governments on Thomas Hobbes, where the state essentially controls everything to maintain order. Now, here's a big point I want to make about this that is not getting a lot of attention. One of the ideas that Thomas Hobbes had about this Leviathan or dictatorship was it has to control the church as well. The church will basically function like an arm of the state, almost like a state agency. The state will control the religious ministers. It'll control who's hired as a minister. It'll control their salaries. It'll control what they say. That was Hobbes's vision for the church. Now, if you think about what's going on in Russia and in China both, they take a very similar kind of position toward the church or toward religion. In Russia, under Vladimir Putin, the Russian Orthodox Church right now, although there are dissenters, the Russian Orthodox Church is mostly going along with Vladimir Putin and this immoral act of aggression, this invasion of Ukraine. He has the backing of the Russian Orthodox Church because he has the Russian Orthodox Church basically in his pocket. That's a problem, right? Similar thing going on in China, even though it's officially atheistic as a communist state. What the Chinese government has been doing over the last, number of years, they've been using philosophies like Confucianism, this Eastern philosophy, and manipulating that as kind of a national religion or national faith. But also they're trying to control the churches, controlling the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. So my point is that Hobbesian vision from the 17th century of an all-powerful state that controls religion, that is alive and well, friends, in the here and now, unfortunately. In both nations, if you think about it, in China and in Russia both, this idea of religious liberty or freedom of conscience, they view that as a threat to national unity and to their political authority. Freedom of conscience, religious liberty is the big threat to them. And it's not hard to see why. Because if you're a person with a conscience, with a religious conscience, you're going to say no to the state when the state is trying to do things that violate your rights, that violate what's just and what's humane. You'll stand against the state when you have freedom of conscience. So the first thing that these authoritarian governments are going to do is they're going to try to control religion, try to control conscience. That's exactly what China and Russia have been up to. And that brings us back to the American scene, because this is one of the amazing things it seems to me about the United States, that in the way that we embody this principle of freedom, political freedom and religious freedom, it really is unique in world history. Other governments come close. And I love my British friends, and there's such a debt we owe to our British friends. And yet the Americans took some of those English principles of constitutionalism, the Magna Carta, the rights of Englishmen. We took it and man, we ran with it. we really ran with it in a couple of ways. First of all, the American founders believed that government really exists to protect our natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Those are the rights that John Locke talked about. The Americans took it, certainly embraced it. Jefferson, talked about it as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? But the basic concept is life, liberty, and property. And the fundamental purpose of government is to secure those rights, those natural, God-given, unalienable rights. And if government violates those rights, consistently violates those rights, takes them away, then that government is no longer legitimate. Here's how John Locke put it. And again, this is what influenced the American founders 100 years after Locke. Locke wrote it this way: when the political authority, when the government tries to take away and destroy the property of the people or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, the government, they put themselves into a state of war with the people. They put themselves into a state of war with the people. That's Locke in the second treatise. The American founders, they loved Locke's second treatise. And they had that copy in their hands, probably literally as they're going into battle in the revolution, right alongside with the Bible. A lot of these soldiers, they've got Locke's second treatise in their heads, at least, the right to revolt against an unjust government. And think about what the Ukrainians are doing right now. They are fighting for their freedoms, as the president of Ukraine and others have said. That's what they're fighting against, is arbitrary power. So this Lockean idea back from the 17th century, friends, it is alive and well. But unfortunately, so is the Hobbesian idea, the all-powerful state. And that's part of the battle we're seeing. The Americans uniquely said, no, government exists for the purpose of protecting those rights. That's the first big point. Second big point, what did the founders do? They designed a constitution that can check the will to power. The natural drift is toward governments that become big, overreaching, intrusive. That's the natural drift of things. And the Americans said, okay, we're going to learn from the past. We're going to develop a government, a type of government that learns how to control itself. Listen to a few words from James Madison here in the Federalist Papers. Madison said this: in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You first enable the government to control the governed. And in the next place, you oblige it to control itself. Government to control or restrain itself. A dependence on the people, Madison says, is the primary control on their government, on the people. But experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. In other words, more measures are going to be needed, auxiliary precautions. We got to have people who are self-governing, absolutely. But we got to have a government itself, the structure of government itself, that makes it more difficult for people to abuse power, right? So what's the answer to that problem? One big answer to that problem, it's a three-word answer, guys. I'll put it out there and see what you guys might say to this. It was a question that was put to the Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia when he was asked, explain the success of the American experiment in self-government. How do you explain it, Justice Scalia? He gave a three-word answer. Can anybody guess what the three-word answer is? Just thinking out loud to yourself. Separation of powers. That's what Scalia said, the separation of powers. Three branches of government: executive, judicial, legislative, all with very discrete roles and responsibilities. And the message of the Constitution to the three branches of government, it's another three-word answer from Loconte: stay in your lane. Stay in your lane to the different branches of government. That would be a way to restrain this impulse to the will to power. If you think, let's go back to Russia and China again. There is no practical separation between those three branches of government. They exist in theory: an executive branch, right? A legislative branch and a judicial branch. But in reality, the other two branches, legislative and judicial, are controlled by the executive, meaning the president of Russia the president, the premier there of China. So that's the problem. And then the will to power just takes over. So let me make that point here, guys. Not only did the Americans do that, they did another thing, though, instead. Not only this Constitution that respects human rights, our natural rights, and how to protect them, but they added something else. They added a Bill of Rights. And this is what the different states, some of them insisted on. As soon as the Constitution was ratified, a lot of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention there in 1787, they said, you know, this is a wonderful Constitution, but it's not good enough. We want a Bill of Rights to really make sure you can protect those basic rights of what? Freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to petition the government, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. They institute that, and I want to make this other point before we close. The crown jewel, if you think about it, the crown jewel of the Bill of Rights really goes back to this point we made a minute ago: freedom of conscience, religious liberty. And I think that's the reason it's the first freedom among all those freedoms in the Bill of Rights. It's not an accident about those two clauses, the no establishment clause, the free exercise clause. Together, they form a single provision, really, in the First Amendment, and it's the provision of freedom of conscience in matters of faith. Why? Because the founders knew you've got to have individuals and associations like churches and faith-based groups. You've got to give them the freedom to challenge the government. Challenge the government when it starts to take away or trample the rights of the people. And Madison, again, is the great guide on this. Let me read you a few lines from Madison, his thinking on this, not long before the First Amendment was drafted. This is in 1785. Here's how Madison put it: the religion of every man, or every woman, we could add, the religion of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. Conviction and conscience. And then he says this right is in its nature an unalienable right, meaning no one can take it away. Government can't take it away. The church can't take it away. It is an unalienable right. And he goes on, because the opinions of men, depending only on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men. And it is unalienable because what is here a right towards men, respecting that freedom, he says it's also a duty to the Creator. It's a duty to exercise that right to the Creator, to God. That's a big deal because nobody in 1785 is really talking that way in terms of government. And that's why the founders separated church and state, not to punish the church, not to keep religion out of our politics, but to protect the integrity of religion, to protect the integrity of those religious institutions, to protect that unalienable right, freedom of religion, as the first freedom in the whole panoply of freedoms that we have. And if you think about it again, China, Russia, other authoritarian states, North Korea, this is one of the first freedoms they are going to trample and try to control: religious liberty. Why? Because when the when the state sets itself up as like an idol, well, who can challenge the idol of the state, the idolization of the state? It's people of faith. Across religious traditions, freedom of conscience can say no to the demands of the state when those demands become unjust. That is a uniquely American kind of thing, that First Amendment religious liberty. So think about this as we close. America is an experiment in self-government, right? An experiment. And by its nature, experiments can fail, ladies and gentlemen. They can fail. They can degenerate into tyranny and to dictatorship. And that is what happened to democracies and republics throughout history, from the ancient Greeks to the Romans to the Italian city-states of Venice. And the American founders, boy, guys, they really knew this history and they studied it. Why do democracies or republics fail? What causes them to fail? And I think this explains, you guys will probably know this famous exchange that Ben Franklin had as he's coming out there of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. You remember, these guys were doing the convention thing, their Constitutional Convention, in secret. Nobody blabbed to the press. Nobody knew what was going on behind closed doors. So by the time the last day of the convention, this crowd forms in Philadelphia outside the hall. Ben Franklin comes out and everybody wants to know. Somebody approaches Ben Franklin. Mr. Franklin, what do we have? Meaning, what kind of a government are you giving us? Are you giving us some constitutional monarchy? Or giving us what are you giving us? Ben Franklin answers. Some of you will know that answer. He says, a republic, if you can keep it. A republic, if you can keep it. What does he mean by if you can keep it? Well, they're aware of this history of failure, and they're aware of the example of Rome. Rome had a republic, friends. You had magistrates sharing power with the Senate, but it broke down. It broke down. And this is what Cicero, Rome's greatest statesman, pointed out. What he was trying to preserve was Rome's republic. And listen to Cicero as it's breaking down. This was his great lament, and this is worth thinking about when we think about our own moment. Listen to these lines from Cicero. Our generation, after inheriting our political organization like a magnificent picture, but now fading with age, not only neglected to restore the original colors, we didn't even bother to ensure that it retained its basic form, its faintest outlines. And then he goes on, of this great tragedy, we are not only bound to give a description, we must somehow defend ourselves as if we were arraigned on a capital charge. You get what he's saying? The profound failure of Rome's leaders to take seriously this great inheritance in self-government that they've been given. They were squandering it. And that was a great crime, he's saying. Now, Cicero was despised by the political establishment of his day for calling them out, right? And so what happens? Well, they send out soldiers to get him at his seaside villa in Formia in 43 BC, December 7th. Mark Antony sends out the soldiers, the assassins. As they approach Cicero with swords drawn, Cicero reportedly displayed a kind of stoic defiance. Here's what he said. There is nothing proper about what you are doing, soldier, but at least try to kill me properly. They cut his throat. They cut his throat. When Cicero died, for all practical purposes, the Roman Republic died with him. So the question for us is, friends, what about our democratic republic? Is it going to go the way of Rome? Will our democracy degenerate into something like an autocracy or a dictatorship? This is something President Lincoln grappled with. He grappled with this question, I think, like no one else. Lincoln warned about what he called the silent artillery of time. Let that phrase hang in the air. The silent artillery of time, the pounding, the natural drift toward decay, the breakdown of Republican virtue and self-government. Listen to Lincoln as we close. If destruction be our lot, if that be our future, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, he said, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Well, the founders gave us a republic, friends, but it's our job, it's our obligation, it's the privilege of every citizen to keep it. Thanks for listening.
Wow. That was just such powerful opening comments. And thank you so much. And you know, what we're trying to do here at Constituting America is keep the republic. We remember those words from Benjamin Franklin every day. And I know that's what you're doing at the Heritage Foundation and all your great work with civic education in so many different ways. So, and that's, you know, we just thank all of our donors too, who make our work possible. I know that's what everyone on this, all of the audience in our chat are here because we're all trying to keep our republic. And, you know, you had so many great comments. We try to take a quick little clip, less than a minute clip of a highlight of our guest opening comments. I don't know how Elizabeth and I are going to pick what we're going to choose. You had so many great nuggets in there. I am going to, however, turn it over to Tova because I want to make sure that Tova gets her questions in and Jordan and Jewel get theirs in. So Tova, I know you've got some great questions lined up. I'm going to hand it to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your enthusiasm. You definitely made the topic very interesting. I have a lot of questions, but I think my kind of big one is this idea, this Locke idea of the consent of the governed.
Yes.
And what you were talking about, the unique American belief that people are able to kind of dissolve the government if it doesn't work for us. But I think that gets tricky, right? Because what does it mean when we have an unjust government? Yeah. Who determines that? And I think it's kind of hard, like this idea of consent of the governed, because the governed doesn't seem to me to be one mind, especially now with polarization pushing Americans so far apart. Yes. How do we know what the consent of the governed truly is? Some people want strict regulations on gun control, some want none, some want yes. abortion to be banned, some want no restrictions on abortion. And a lot of these desires of yes. the governed are actually like mutually exclusive. You can't have both. So first of all, how do we know what the consent of the governed is? What does that mean? And second, how do we know, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but how do we know when we need to dissolve the bonds of government? Because that's such kind of an extreme solution. Obviously, in the case of the American Revolution, it was needed, but yes. when we're trying to continue this idea into modern times, how do we know? Because we are also a country, of the rule of law as well. Yes. And up until that point, like breaking the rule of law is very much looked down upon. Yes. Until, it gets to a certain point, and then we're allowed to dissolve the bonds of government. Like what is the line? I guess those are some of the questions that are in my head.
Yes, Tova, those are fabulous questions, and they're big questions, and they're tough questions. And I got to be honest with you, as an historian, there are questions that political scientists struggle with, and I'm not a political scientist, so it's above my pay grade, but I'm going to take a crack at it anyway. Because they're terrific questions. All right, how do you know what the consent of the governed is on some of these questions? Well, think about it. This is so much where the role of the legislative body, the whole separation of powers, comes into play. We're having this debate right now. If you guys have been following the news with the abortion question, right? You probably have heard some of the news that it because of this memo that's been leaked, this opinion, by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court may overturn Roe versus Wade, that Supreme Court ruling from 1973. And what that would mean is it would turn this very controversial issue of abortion, turn it back to the states to then decide. And then you have to say, well, what does the consent of the governed mean there? Well, it's going to mean something different in each of the states. And this is, I didn't make this point in the opening remarks, but this was the other means by which the founders gave us a way to discover what is the consent of the governed. They gave us a federal system, not only a separation of powers, but we have a federal government, but we also have state governments, right, Tova? So we have these state governments that are also legislating. We're not just legislating at the federal level, we're legislating at the state level. And it's good to legislate at the state level and even at the city level, the city council level, because that's closest to the people. The closer you get to the people, the better off you are, because then you're more likely to know, all right, what do the majority of the people really believe? And that's how we tend to govern in this country. We have majority rule. Even as we try to protect minority rights, that's one of the reasons we have a Bill of Rights, to protect minority rights so they're not trampled. But the way you determine the consent of the governed is through majority rule. Local level, at the city level, state level, governors and state legislatures, and then at the federal level. That's the best way to discern it. And we're going to constantly battle that from national versus state, and the states doing their own thing, what they call the laboratories of democracy, right? The states. That's a pretty good system. So it's not just top down. We don't just issue edicts. They don't come from the chief executive. That's not his job to make law. The president's job is not to make law. The Supreme Court's job is not to make law, but to allow the states and the localities to make those laws. So that's the first part of the answer. And I'm going to take your follow-up question on that. But let me take a stab at the second part of the question, because it's a great. When do we throw the bums out? When do we cast out government? How bad does it have to get before there's something like a democratic revolution to challenge let's just say, for the sake of argument, challenging the federal government when it oversteps? Look, if the Supreme Court, for example, doesn't challenge what the federal government is trying to do, or what Congress has done, if the Supreme Court won't be that arbiter, if Congress won't be an arbiter in that way, what the chief executive is doing, and if the chief executive itself, if the president is not going to somehow challenge unjust laws, then what's the recourse? The language that John Locke used was a series of usurpations. The word usurpation, acting unjustly, a chain of events, a pattern of behaving in a way that violates our natural rights to life, liberty, and property. And the founders picked up on that language, and it's literally in the Declaration, when a long train of abuses and usurpations. That's actually the language that Locke used in the second treatise, a long train of abuses. So it doesn't happen as soon as there's one example of government trampling our rights. But according to Locke and the founders, it seems to me, if that's a good model, if we see a continued pattern of trampling basic rights and freedoms, the right to life, liberty, and property, then the people have some right to revolt. Now, what does revolt mean? Well, look, I'm just a humble historian. So I first want to say, before you get your gun, before you lock and load, before you get your gun, I believe in the Second Amendment, before you go that route, make sure you exhaust every constitutional means and method we have to challenge unjust authority. And we have a lot of tools at our disposal. Before there's a physical revolt in the streets, we better make sure we're doing everything we can to follow the Constitution, to defend the Constitution against those people who are trying to trample it. Let me stop there. I'm talking too much. Tova, does that help a bit?
Yeah, that definitely does. I didn't really think about it in the framework of the states representing the consent of the governed. I thought that was really interesting. And then what about, could you talk more about like minority rights, the rights of the minority? How do they factor in and their consent to be governed when the majority decision might not be what they want in mild cases, or in major cases, you have institutions like slavery or women not having the right to vote, or different oppressive systems. How does that factor in? Would then, because I think even today you have groups that are not in the majority saying, well, our rights are being trampled, which gives us the right to riot or to push back violently, and that's kind of the framework they're using. So how would you respond to that sort of thinking?
Excellent question. And this was the contradiction, of course, right from the beginning with the founding, with the Constitution and those early years where you still had deeply embedded in the American system was slavery, right? And was racism. So you had a whole category of who should have been citizens, African Americans in particular, and women will get the right to vote eventually, but as well, they don't have the full rights of citizens for a long time in our history, right? That's a huge problem. So the basic principle that Locke articulated, and then the founders, which I think began to change the equation, was equal justice under the law. Equal justice under the law, regardless of race, ethnicity, or religious belief. And that's also important. It didn't matter what religion you have in this country. You don't have to have a particular religious belief to run for office or to be treated equally in the courts. That is a huge innovation, equal justice under the law, regardless of race, creed, religion. The challenge, of course, was you had to make that real and practical. Even after the Civil War, we still needed 100 years later, it took another 100 years to get the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s and to really end discrimination in law against African Americans. That was a huge milestone for us. It took much too long for it to happen, if we're honest, right? 100 years after the Civil War, we finally get a Civil Rights Act, ending segregation, ending discrimination in law. So now, look, it seems to me, in terms of what the law says, the rights of minorities are really protected. That doesn't mean that people aren't going to be unhappy with certain policies, crime policies, how we treat criminals, our incarceration rate, who's in jail, who's not. I understand those concerns. But the way the law is read, now it comes down to enforcing the law in a fair-minded, equal way, equal justice under the law. If there are certain policies, like let's say, for example, criminalization of drug policies, if there's some policy that seem to be making it harder for minorities to get a fair shake, then we got to look at that hard. We got to look at that really hard. If minorities are treated more harshly under the law because the minorities, well, that's a problem. because that's not what the law says. It has to be equal justice under the law. It seems to me, though, those issues are going to be addressed at that local level, at that state level, typically. I'm not leaving the federal government out of the mix, but typically go after the states first and see what's happening there, if that helps answer the question.
Yes, thank you so much. I really like that answer. And thank you for kind of engaging with that topic. I just had one more question. You talked kind of about this Hobbian idea, if that's a word, of religion where the state would control the church.
Yeah.
But what about kind of the other side of the coin, which is the church controlling the state? What does that come from? You know, I know some people would have more influence of the church in the state. Is that on the Locke Hobbes dichotomy, or is that something separate? And how does that factor into a constitutional framework?
That's a fabulous question, Tove. Another fabulous question. You know, I'll tell you what, when I was teaching there at the King's College, having freshmen in my class like you would keep me in the game with those kinds of questions. Just terrific. So you gotta knock them out of the park there at Harvard. This is one of the hugely important questions to kind of address. Okay, what is going to be the role of the church with respect to government, with respect to the state? And the pattern in Europe was church and state were kind of trying to work together to bring about a certain vision, a political vision. And quite often in Europe, in Catholic France, in Anglican England, if you didn't belong to the national church, the church that was supported by the state, if you didn't belong to that national church, you were in trouble. You didn't have the full rights of a citizen. You would be penalized if you didn't go to the national church and support the national church. Well, the Americans looked at that and said, you know, that's not working very well. That's a problem. We can't enforce religious belief. We can't enforce the creed, somebody's religious creed. We have to somehow institutionally separate church and state, not because we don't like religion, but we want to somehow protect the religious liberty of people. And as soon as you combine church and state, you immediately are going to be violating people's consciences. Their own freedom of religion is going to be trampled. And then their right to petition the government or challenge the government or pursue those basic rights is going to be compromised. So the Lockean vision is separate church and state for the sake of the health of religion, and so the government doesn't become corrupted by it as well. But the Hobbesian vision was, well, you know, we really need to have everybody on board here with this national government, with this Leviathan. We need to have the church on board and singing our tune. What do you call it? What's the word I want here? Singing in the same choir with the church, reading the same playbook, and never challenging the state, even when it does all kinds of crazy things like invading Ukraine. So get the Russian Orthodox Church on board, blessing Vladimir Putin and blessing the Russian government, church and state working together for pretty wicked ends, if you think about it, if I could speak my own opinion now on what Russia is doing in Ukraine. The Americans say, no, we've tried that church-state combination, church and state working together. We've seen it in Europe. And what it leads to all the time, it seems, is corrupted government, corrupted church, and compromised religion. And we want a different path. And I think that is part of the success of the American experiment, why we've never had a religious war in this country, and why we have such a religiously free and robust country. I think that's a great blessing for us. What do you think?
I agree. Well, thank you so much. I've kind of selfishly hogged all the time because this is such an interesting discussion, but I'm now happy to pass to Kathy or whoever else wants to take it.
Great.
Yeah, Jewel, I'm sure you've got some great questions, so let's hear from you.
All right. A great topic. It of course is part of the series that we've been doing. So last week, we went over elements of different kind of governments. So we've talked about democracy and republic, and we've talked about these differences between democracy, republic, monarchy, and we've come to these really core differences in what these governments represent. But there's one element of these governments which to me seems to be the fundamental philosophical difference between the way that the governments act, and that is where the rights come from and what is above the state. And a dictatorship seems to be what could be. Seems like when a person believes that they have the ability to grant rights, whereas what we have democratic republic manifests when the people believe that the government exists to protect the rights that already exist.
Yes.
So I guess my question comes into play is that we have a difference in America that's not really we have difference of opinion in America that relatively never gets discussed. It was a difference of opinion that the people at the time of the revolution discussed constantly and thoroughly, and there was pamphlets, and it was common. As a historian, you obviously know all of this, that things like common sense and these things that the people were reading and were inflaming them. But the core difference of the right and the left don't necessarily, in America, if we were ever to push towards having a dictatorship, it would be because more of our people then do not have that same idea that the rights come from God, not from the state. That debate is huge.
Yeah.
It's a huge idea.
Yes.
And we discuss the thing smaller than it because I think that idea is too big to fit into a soundbite, and it's too big of a discussion to have always on the news. And it really is such a deep personal discussion. Yeah. So we want to educate. We want to make these show matter. We want to change lives. We believe in the American dream. We believe in the American experiment. We believe in these ideals. But if either I'm wrong that that's the core issue, or the question is, how do we then talk about that core issue?
Yeah. Jewel, that is a fabulous, fabulous question. And I think I'm not a philosopher. I'm just a humble historian. But I think you're pretty close. I think you're really pretty close to what the core issue is. It's not only about rights and where rights come from. You're absolutely correct. People from a more traditional or conservative background say, these rights, life, liberty, property, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, these are natural rights by virtue of how God has made us, made in the image of a creator, a God who speaks, a God who is willful, who has a will. He's given creatures made in his image will, creativity, right? So these rights grow out of this personhood, what it means to be a human being. It grows out of being made in the image of this creative, willful God, right? If you don't have that viewpoint, then you think either these rights are expendable and you also multiply rights. So our friends on the hard left, they claim a lot of things are rights that really aren't rights. They're kind of aspirations. So maybe we want healthcare to be available to people. If you start calling that a basic unalienable right, well, now you're going to start talking about, well, government has to do something about that in a major way, right? But people of a more traditional perspective say, well, that's not really a right. That's something we'd like to have in society, healthcare available, just like I'd like to have 2 weeks paid vacation, that'd be nice too. But that's not a natural right. Life, liberty, and property, those are natural rights. So that's the one thing I'd say. The other thing I'd say, and it's back to your point though, Jewel, is the traditional view of rights, not just John Locke, but even before John Locke, even with Cicero, but certainly right down through Locke and the founders, is these rights come with obligations to our neighbor and to society at large, and ultimately obligations to God, to the creator. So let me read you a few lines from John Locke on this, because I'm kind of a Locke guy, you should probably figure it out by now. But the American founders really embraced this. This is Locke again from the second treatise. And he says this: for men, and he meant men and women, men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, all servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property. Now think about those words. Being the workmanship made in the image of an omnipotent God, infinitely wise, servants of this sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property. What's that sound like to you? Sounds like to me that My ultimate authority is not government, it's God. I'm ultimately accountable to God. I belong to him. So there is not only do I have rights, but I have obligations. In other words, there's a moral law to the universe, and God gave us that law. I think many friends on the left, they don't really believe in this moral law. And if you don't believe in this moral law connected to the God of the universe, then I think you don't feel a sense of constraint. You do what your impulses tell you to do. You're not bound by moral laws at the end of the day, a transcended moral law. But people of a more traditional view say, no, we have rights and obligations, though. Rights come with obligations. Go ahead, Jewel.
And if you're not able to, you know, if you believe that we have these, that there is this moral law, and you believe in an ultimate creator in that way, then there are times when what is the most practical and even effective action for a government to take, we still would not enable, because we don't think the government necessarily has the right to do it. And then there's a crossroads between where two people have a very hard time coming to a consensus. And
Yes.
on the next side of that, kind of the same idea.
Yes.
We had the federal system. We have the federal system. And to me, it seems like the founding fathers gave us that for the reason of discussion we're having today, but it eventually broke down. So my question is that, as a historian, there will be asking you this as a historian. Do you believe that people of the past, who we oftentimes look down upon greatly, but at the time of the founding and after, had these discussions about even the common man, had these ideas about these big ideas, had these discussions about these big ideas in a more honest way than we do today, even though there was less literacy and etc.?
Wow, that's a really perceptive question. If you mean by in a more honest way, you mean kind of more educated about the issues and more frank about what's at stake. Is that what you mean, Jewel?
Yes, and with almost trying to settle it for like, do you think that they actually wanted the answer for themselves personally, I guess, as if they were trying to come to some truth, and that's where was the basis of the debate or discussion?
Yeah, let me give you a qualified answer to that. I think we have to be frank and say, on the question of slavery, on the Constitutional Convention, on the one hand, nobody had a kind word to say about it at the convention. Nobody was standing up for slavery, but they didn't really want to address it at the convention because they believed that if we try to put an end to slavery, and they knew, the founders, I think, had a guilty conscience about it. They knew that slavery violated their principles of equality and liberty. They knew it. But they also knew, if we try to ban it right now at the convention, we'll never get the southern states to sign on, and we'll have no constitution. We'll be hopelessly divided, and we'll be vulnerable to foreign invasion. So they kicked the can down the road, right? So in that sense, there wasn't a full kind of honesty, if you will, with all of that. But you can understand why there wasn't, because so much was at stake. You got to bring the country together. But on these other questions about, okay, the will to power and the willingness, the readiness of people to seize government, for it to become too powerful, to trample our rights, they were ruthlessly honest about that. Ruthlessly honest about that. Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Adams, and they were so acutely conscious of the radical thing they were attempting: self-government, separation of powers, separation of church and state. No one had really tried this before in this vast territory, a vast republic. Self-government, no king, no national church. What are you, crazy, man? They knew this was a radical thing. And they were ruthlessly honest with what was at stake. They knew it could fail. I think that's why Franklin says, okay, you got a republic if you can keep it. If you can keep it. There's the poignancy. Franklin is very aware this thing can fail. And it's going to be up to us to sustain this Republican government. So yeah, I think there was an honesty then that we don't have now on the big questions of self-government and really the nature of man, frankly, the nature of man.
Thank you for a great show. I bet we have these audience questions we've got to get to, but appreciate it again. Thank you for being on with us.
Thank you, Joel. Great questions, man. Great questions.
Well, thank you, Jewel. and Tova, both really great questions. And our audience has got some wonderful questions and comments. John Chambers says, they will lose Republican virtue when they forget the definition of republic. And I think that's so true, that so many people these days don't really understand the definition of a republic.
Right.
And then we also, one other, John Chambers also said, in dictatorship, rights come from the dictator. No.
You know, that's great. That's a great point, because citizenship, the whole concept of citizenship, which goes back to the ancient Greeks, was you have to participate in the life of the polis, the life of the city-state, in our case, the life of the republic. And the Greeks said, if you don't participate, they had a word for that, right? The idiotai, the idiot. The person who doesn't participate, take responsibility for this republic. Great point.
Now, and then Tracy has a question that I had wanted to ask, but Tracy has also brought up the Freedom House Index, that the Freedom House has come out with I guess a study recently that shows that only 20% of the world's population live in freedom right now. Wow. And do you, bringing this back to present day, yeah, what are your comments on that?
Wow, that is pretty sobering. I think that's probably about right. It sounds more dire than I would have thought if it's that bad. But I think it's absolutely true to say different governments, Venezuela, of course, North Korea has been what it is for so long, China, a resurgent Russia, India is showing some signs of moving in an unhealthy direction, no question about that. Pakistan, Iraq is struggling, certainly Afghanistan now with the Taliban having taken control. I think what this suggests to us, ladies and gentlemen, is that dictatorship, the will to power, that is the natural drift of things. That's the easy way. And democracy, Republican government, self-government, that's the road not chosen. That's the hard path. That's the hard way to go. And I think there's a line between civilization, democratic, Republican civilization, and barbarism. And that line is a thinner line than we imagine. And that helps to explain what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now, the line between civilization and barbarism. And that ought to be a wake-up call to us. It is hard to sustain self-government over the long haul, to borrow that phrase again from Lincoln, the silent artillery of time. That's what he deeply worried about, even as a young man, a young politician. He knew the natural drift is toward decay, disorder, and dictatorship. The Americans, in a sense, we're trying to defy history. We are trying to defy history. And it's going to be up to all of us, all of you, to help us to continue to defy the natural drift toward the will to power and to maintain self-government.
And speaking of that, Stanley Hughes asks, how are we currently following or not following those founding ideals? And I know we could do a whole show, probably a whole series on that. And we only have, just a few minutes, but would you want to try to hit the highlights of that?
Yeah, I'll maybe on the negative, but also the positive side. On the negative side, you could argue, and I'm not trying to be partisan here, but certainly under the current administration at the federal level with the Biden administration, there's this willingness to use executive power to overturn or to ignore what's happening in the states, to ignore the democratic process. There's been talk, for example, in the Biden administration about stacking the Supreme Court, adding members to the Supreme Court so that you get the outcome that you want, that judges will then function as legislators. Now think about that. When you have the president of the United States, like Joe Biden and his colleagues, arguing that they want the Supreme Court to legislate, to bring about an outcome that they want, that they couldn't achieve through the democratic process, the legislative process, then what you're doing is you're saying you don't believe in the separation of powers anymore. That's a bad thing. That is a move toward dictatorship when you don't care about the separation of powers. That's on the negative side. But here's the positive side. We've also seen, in part thanks to COVID, how our public schools have been behaving, what they've been teaching young people or not teaching them in the classroom. And we're seeing, I think, a grassroots movement, and you guys are a great part of that in Constituting America, a grassroots movement that's saying, hey, wait a minute, parents, they should have control over the education of their children. And that is a natural right. Talk about natural rights, the rights of parents to educate their children. There's nothing more fundamental than that. And parents are pushing back, especially in states like Virginia, where you're hearing for the first time about these town hall meetings, PTA meetings, parents getting involved and saying, hey, wait a minute, we want to have influence over the curricula and what our kids are being taught. That's a really good sign. And I think that movement is a real movement. And you're not going to be able to shut these parents up, thank goodness. They are alive and on the move in different organizations like yours, like Moms for Liberty and other organizations that are really raising the flag now for parental rights. That's democracy at the grassroots action, which is very encouraging to me.
Well, thank you so much. And you're a huge part of it too. And your videos that you have that we hopefully did we answer that, Aubrey? Did we put that in the link so that everybody has a link to his video?
I think we still need to send that in.
Do you want to, let's see, hopefully Elizabeth can ask that real quick here at the end about his video, and then we can answer that so everybody has a link to the videos. But Dr. Loconte, we want to thank you so much for being with us today. It was just fascinating, and so many of the points that you made, I don't think that we had all really thought about. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, and your team. Thank you so much. Great privilege to be with you.
Jewel and Jorn and Tova, any parting words before we go?
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us your time and expertise. This was really, really fascinating. And thank you all for watching.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate your time, and thanks for another great show. And thank you for everything Hillsdale does as well.
Well, thank you. And we want to thank everybody in our audience again. And we want to invite everybody to be back with us next week. We're going to be talking more in depth about something that you started with us on today. Dr. Loconte, is the Roman Republic. We're going to be talking a lot more about that, about the downfall of the Roman Republic and what our founders learned. So thank you to everyone. And did we get that link in there, Aubrey?
Yep, we got it. So everyone can go and look at that.
Yeah, so we encourage everybody to look in your Q&A and grab that link and check out Dr. Loconte's videos at the Heritage Foundation and your great book. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys. Great to be with you. The glory that was Rome for next week. All right. Sounds like fun.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.